So I've been thinking into what Wizard's next update is going to touch on, and I've seen plenty of positives. However, there's one particular change that I don't think KI knows how damaging it can be to the game as a whole. I want to touch on a few things in the game that seriously need looked over, and how to offer alternatives to the current system. So this video is only half scripted because I wanted to get my thoughts out as soon as possible before the update comes out and possibly breaks what's left of the game. Now, I want to make it clear I'm not a member, so I cannot try out the test realm to see how these changes apply. I can only put my thoughts out there. However, KI has made a post asking for player feedback. And I think even if I cannot engage in the content, I could still try to give feedback based on how the original game works. Now, first and foremost, reading over the notes, I had assumed that there was a chance at losing Spellements if you refunded after the update. But it seems like that's not the case. When they make the Spellement cost cheaper, they will still refund you your leftover Spellements you would have had before the update if you decide to not reset your Spellements. So on that front, in any previous chats I may have had, I may have jumped the gun a bit. I ended up logging into my game and refunding all of my spells, so that's a potential waste of gold on my end. However, due to how buggy these updates tend to be, I still do recommend resetting your Spellment upgrades before the update comes out, if things like Portal of Peril are a thing to look at. Wizard's recent updates feel like they've been running into several issues. Like mentioned before, Portal of Peril was an amazing in concept, but incredibly bugged on release, and their fix was simply removing it entirely. Then there was the Bazaar update, which didn't help players at all and made botting even more prevalent, despite one of the ideas of this update being to counter bots. Their Shadow update, which caused a deck bloating issue where the devs acknowledged they try not to mess with the speed deck setup, but moved on with it anyways, making 7-pip AoE spells the more default option to play efficiently. I've noticed a trend with Wizard adding updates where half is stuff nobody asked for, makes the game far more tedious for players to play through, or straight up breaks other things. Their Shadow Pact system broke so many boss battles not built around them, and to my knowledge, these issues haven't been fixed. Honestly, a lot of these updates feel really rushed and feels like they just need more time in development before being released. I'm not a game dev, and these things I'm calling out might be a lot more of an issue to fix than what I'm thinking, but that begs the question, why release broken things instead of holding on to them and determining if they're actually good for the game or not? While Wizard has a lot of problems with updates breaking things or feeling half-baked, I'd be dumb to not acknowledge the genuine good things that come out of it. I like the new Shadow update. The Shadow Enchant update makes the unused Shadow spells have more utility when unenchanted, and the Shadow Enchant's giving them a big DPS buff while having a risk-reward system to add some good options. I really like the Arc Mastery system and how dual schooling is a legit gameplay style that you can do now. In a card game sense, this makes sense, allowing players more freedom and more strategy to their game. And dual schooling adds more interactions between spells in combat to unlock strategies I don't think most people think of. Using a spell like Link, setting up a hot and a dot on the board, which can combo into Seraph using the hot to buff its hit, or Cyclops to use the dot to trap stack onto the enemy. The pin system allowing players to customize their dual school setup is an amazing change to allow a player to not need to farm multiple sets of gear and just adjust the one set they have to work with an Arc Mastery setup they'd like. And the Arc Mastery system opening up options to give schools some extra utility inside combat, like satyrs to better sustain schools that struggle to keep themselves alive, for example. One of the major downsides holding the Arc Mastery system back is the training point system. I'm gonna say it, learning prerequisite spells in other schools is such an outdated system that actively ruins the idea of Arc Mastery. Let me give you an example. If I wanted to weave into Pyromancy as a Necromancer, I could potentially learn a new fusion formula spell called Pyre Dragon. To learn this fusion, it costs me 1 training point, and requires me to also have the spell Hierophant. Now, Hierophant is a pyromancer spell, and I'm a necromancer, so Hierophant is going to cost me training points. Now, for those that don't play this game, you're probably thinking, why not just buy the Hierophant spell with 1 training point then? The issue for that is Hierophant has a prerequisite spell you must learn to have it. In order to learn Hierophant, you must learn each prerequisite spell that leads up to Hierophant. There are 8 steps before Hierophant you must pay training points for, making Hierophant essentially cost 9 training points to buy. And then Pyre Dragon, the fusion formula, requires another training point to even have. And then when you add it all together, you have spent 10 training points just to have this one fusion formula. Let me repeat that. Pyre Dragon at minimum requires 10 training points to get. Yes, I know item cards get around this rule, but there are so few options for item cards that it's never really viable to go on that route. Training points are not cheap or readily available to get either. Another spell that people may want to get is something called Epic, which is one of the most useful enchants in the game. You need to buy every prerequisite spell before it, which in total, Epic costs you 6 training points to get. Also, why do some spells have no prerequisites to buy, like Sharpened Blade? The system is inconsistent. The best way to get around this problem was with the current Spellement system, where a player learns up to a spell they wanted to keep, upgrade it with Spellements, and then do the training point buyback, which refunds the spells a player doesn't want while keeping the ones they did want, making the entire prerequisite process pointless and redundant. So to sum it up, any spell that you have upgraded with Spellements will stay in your deck while refunding you all of the training points of the other spells that you haven't upgraded, and any further spells will count the one spell you've upgraded as the prerequisite learned. The reason why people do this is because nobody is using the low tier spell or a majority of those prerequisite spells unless it's a very specific use case situation, which doesn't justify the cost in all of the training points spent. Too many utility spells cost way too many training points, and even as a max level that's done everything, I'm still running into issues with figuring out my training points and where to spend them. Speaking of the training point buyback system not affecting upgraded spells, that leads me to my next issue. When I said earlier the best way to keep spells you want while having training points to encourage a mix and match playstyle is to, unfortunately, pay real money to buy back training points after upgrading the spells you wanted to keep. However, the new update is asking for Spellment upgrades to be permanent. This means if you've upgraded a spell that you probably wanted to keep, does this mean the training point is lost forever? It's like Solar Surge all over again, and if you know, you know. But do you see how this kneecaps creativity in a mix and match system? The one major thing holding this entire thing back is the outdated training point system, its prerequisite requirements, and how there's a chance you can lose training points forever if you upgrade the wrong spells. I can forgive how bloated and tedious grinding Spellements can be, but removing the reset button can legit break the entire game in half. I don't think people realize how much we take the reset button for granted. Now, I wanted to try to offer my ideas and solutions to these potential issues before they get released and become a serious problem. Maybe the devs know more than I do about the system, and they have their own plans and solutions. I can only speculate on potential issues I see now. However, I think it's good to offer my list of potential solutions anyways, so here we go. Remember when I said earlier Pyre Dragon required me to learn the Fusion and Elephant? What if instead of buying all the previous tiers I'm never going to use, why not make Elephant only cost 1 training point from the get-go, and only have a level requirement instead to learn it? This would help fix so many of the issues that the current limited training point system has already. It would also allow players a bit more freedom to pick and use spells they may actually want to have. I'm sure there's plenty of non-pyromancers out there that would like to use Elephant, but they don't want to invest 9 training points into it just to have it. You'd probably end up with far more diverse decks that break away from the current boring gameplay loop too. Now, if you want a lore reason as to how your character can do this, then I'll offer this. At the end of Imperia, you use a power that essentially grants you the ultimate arc mastery, being able to effortlessly use all schools of magic for one scripted fight. What if the player could have a quest or unlock after that to be able to select which spells they want to learn from a list without needing prerequisites, since they essentially became a Paradox avatar at that point? As for the selective training point buyback, allow players to select which spells they no longer want to keep to get training points off spells they want back, instead of wiping a player's entire slate clean to go relearn most of those spells back anyways. It is annoying to use training point buyback just to go relearn all of my enchantment spells from a completely different location and my other buffs in a completely different world. Also, allow players to select upgraded spells and refund that spell's Spellements after getting the training point back. Players probably do want the freedom to experiment, but they don't want to be punished into wasting training points on essentially useless spells further down the road. What if spell-weaving spells didn't require training points to learn, and were simply instead rewarded to the player by completing their prerequisite spell quest? Training points are already in short supply when you go into multi-schooling, and if you're concerned about players abusing using multiple weave school spells, just make the spell weave spells only available to a certain type of weaver. Here's an example. If you're weaving into Theurgy, you can't use the Diviner Weaver's Dual Blade spell, and no access to fusion formulas to a school you're not weaving into at that time. Also, allow players the ability to change their selected weaving school on the fly when out of combat. It's a chore to have to run clear to the weaving grotto just to change your weaving school for 1 to 2 spells. Players can set up for different situations and strategies if they were given the freedom to swap between battles and allowed access to the spells from simply completing the associated weaving rank. And if you want a challenge, make it so players can't change their weaving school in advanced dungeons. This also brings back a rewarding system of getting the player something new to work towards. Learning new spells with effort is a fun thing, and something I miss sorely from Arc 1's progression. Also, a small quality of life idea, because I don't think I'm going to fit this anywhere else. When you have a fusion formula in hand, can we get a display of what the fused card will end up being before fusing the card? Too many spells in this game require training points, from spells you want to weave into to learning prerequisite spells and even shadow spells and formulas. One simple fix, if you're going to ignore everything else, is to just give players access to more training points. As far as I'm aware, the new Darkmoor 2025 update only gave the player 1 training point quest, which is a far cry from a world like Celestia, which gave the player a handful of quests to get more training points for the new schools of magic they introduced there. Darkmoor 2025 introduced a whole plethora of shadow spells, but no training points to really learn them, which makes that Shadow School spell tree dead on arrival. Also, isn't it weird that shadow spells have no prerequisites to learn any of them? I'm just saying. Give players more freedom on how to spend their training points, and maybe give them more access to more training point quests in the future. There, I've given 3 potential alternative fixes to both encourage player creativity and freedom without butchering the entire spell system. I don't want this game to get another crushing update that makes everyone angry and ruins more of the game. Each half-baked update that comes out has been dragging down the game more and more. I don't want to rag on the devs, and I'm sure they're working very hard to keep the game going. I'm simply putting up my feedback and concerns about the update, just like KI is asking their community to do.